Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang, and I'm excited about this podcast because we've got a great guest, Curtis, a longtime friend of yours even. Do you want to introduce our guest?
Yes, it's Ruth López Turley, professor of sociology at Rice University. Ruth, welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thanks so much, Curtis. I'm delighted to be here.
I want to give a little bit of background to my friendship with Ruth, which goes back, I think, over a decade at this point. It began in a program that I started along with Andy Crouch and Michael Lindsay called Veritas Riff, which has been running for quite a while. And listeners might have heard me talk about this in conjunction with some of our past guests like Megan Sullivan, who I also met through Veritas Riff. It's a program that was designed to help Christian intellectuals, Christian academics at leading universities communicate their findings, their expertise to a broader audience. And Ruth was one of our first Veritas Riff fellows, and in many ways, like a paragon for me of the Veritas Riff vision, because not only does she communicate her findings to the broader world, but her findings themselves, like her research itself, is very much geared towards impacting the real world, and in particular, the real world at a place of great impact, which is education. So Ruth is an expert on educational policy, educational systems, educational equity. And we want to talk about all of those issues, educational policy and especially educational equity. But before we get into the specifics of the issue, the other thing that I really just love about Ruth is how much this issue is a personal passion. This is not just an intellectual interest of hers, but education and educational equity has shaped her own life. So before we get into the substance of the issue, Ruth, could you share with our listeners your own personal story, your own journey to where you are now and the role education played in that?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Curtis, for that introduction. I love what I do, and I have to start off by saying that I do what I do precisely because of my personal experiences. I grew up in Laredo, Texas, on the border. My family's from Mexico, and I grew up along the border, experiencing a lot of challenges growing up in a poor family. And the first thing, or I should say one of the first things that I learned growing up in Laredo is just looking around and seeing how hard people worked, especially people in my own family, people like my mother who worked so hard for so little. My mother had an 8th grade education and often worked double shifts, night shifts, worked extremely hard, got very little sleep, never had benefits, never made more than minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just seeing all of those things as a child, not having the terminology for it at the time, but knowing that there's something drastically wrong in this world that has to be addressed, and just desperately wanting to do something about it. So when I had the opportunity through a series of miracles, and I'm using that word for a reason, I had the amazing opportunity not only to go to college, but to go to Stanford and then Harvard and study about these issues that I had experienced. I didn't know that there were people studying poverty, studying educational inequalities. And so maybe not surprisingly, I ended up studying sociology and decided to become a researcher precisely because I wanted to change the world. And I'm not using that phrase lightly. I really genuinely thought this world is broken. It's in need of change. And I want to play a role, no matter how small, but I want to play a role in helping to make things better. And I have to add also my faith played a huge part in that, because I felt that, that God also has a heart for this world and making justice be more of a reality in this world. So I became a sociologist and loved what I did. I started off my career at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the sociology department there, learned a lot of great things there, great colleagues. But after after being promoted with tenure, came to the realization that none of my research had actually had an impact on anything. I could point to nothing that had changed as a result of my research. And don't get me wrong, it's not that my research was a complete waste of time. I learned a lot through that experience. And obviously it built my career. But I couldn't really point to anything that had changed, that had truly changed as a result of my research. And that worried me terribly, because that's the whole point. That's the whole reason I got into this line of work, because like I said, I wanted to change the world. I wanted to have an impact. And I came to the realization that academic research doesn't really have an impact unless you make a very explicit effort to make it have an impact. So that's why I ended up on this path of just really trying to figure out ways to do a better job of connecting academic research to those that could really put that research to use. And unfortunately, it's not through the normal academic publication route. And I think academic publications are important. They play an important role, but that's not really the most effective way for people to use research. So I ended up founding, a little over a decade ago, I founded the Houston Education Research Consortium, or HERC, which was set up as a research practice partnership between Rice University and initially one school district, the Houston Independent School District, which is the largest in Texas. But eventually that expanded to 10 additional Houston area school districts. And that partnership meant that we were working, my research team was working directly with school district leaders to make sure that the research that we were producing, first of all, was relevant, timely, really addressing their research needs, and all aiming to improve educational equity.
So biographically, the Stanford to Harvard to tenure to Rice is not sort of like the default academic path of your average person. What is it? What were some of the key moments? What were some of the key factors that propelled you on, this sort of academic superstar type path? What are the key interventions, I guess, for lack of a better term?
Wait, before you answer that, I want to add one other to the trajectory that makes it even more improbable, is the migrant or immigrant experience in Laredo to Stanford, to Harvard, to tenured professor.
Wait, isn't that the normal path?
Yeah, right.
No, and see, you noticed earlier I used the word miracles, that there were some miracles involved. And the reason why I use that word miracle is because, well, two reasons. One is I could point to specific points in my life where God intervened in miraculous ways, where I begged God to intervene. I don't know if you've ever had those kinds of prayers where it's just you're begging. And you're desperate. You're in a very low point. And while on the one hand, I don't wish these instances on anybody, on the other hand, those instances made me who I am. And I think God put me through those things for a reason. But absolutely, there were several points where I begged God to intervene, and God did intervene. Do you want me to share one quick one?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Story.
Share as much as you're comfortable sharing.
I mean, these are great stories. I think God wants us to share these stories.
Yes.
We need to remember them and share them. So when I was in high school, I had this guidance counselor that had previously been my 6th grade science teacher. So she knew me personally, had known me for several years. And she was the one that gave me information about a summer school program at Harvard. This is while I was in high school in Laredo. And I, of course, thought there's no way I'm getting in. But she pushed me to apply. It's just summer school, right? And I applied, and I did get in, but they didn't offer financial aid for summer school. So I had to take on my very first fundraising project. I was 16 years old, and I had to raise, I don't remember the total amount, but it was several $1,000s, which was a lot of money back then. This was in 1990 or around there.
Oh my gosh, Ruth, can I interject for a second? I
Yes.
may have been one of your counselors at that program because as an undergrad, one of my summer jobs was overseeing
At Harvard summer school.
Yeah, because I was an undergrad.
Oh my
at
goodness!
Harvard.
Maybe we've known each other a lot longer than we thought. Oh, that's crazy.
Anyways,
we'll have to look
ahead.
into this later.
Yes.
Yeah, but no. So so I had to raise money for Harvard summer school, and one of the things that I did was, I wrote letters to local businesses, and I went around meeting with people, just asking them for money. But I had some older siblings that worked at a casa de cambio, which is a money exchange business on the Mexican side of the border, and so they contributed $1,500
wow.
of cash because it worked in a money exchange business. So when I say cash, I mean literally cash. So I went to Nuevo Laredo, so across the border, to pick up $1,500 of cash. 16 years old, by myself, stuffed the cash in my purse, and then proceeded to walk back across the bridge to get to the U.S. And as I was walking across the bridge, I realized my heart sank because I knew that they were going to search my purse, as they usually do. They always search you open the things and I thought, when I get to customs and they see this 16-year-old kid, poor kid, with $1,500 cash, they're going to confiscate it. Like, for sure.
Yeah.
And my heart was pounding as I was every step crossing that bridge. And I thought,
not only to confiscate you, they'll probably arrest you on suspicion.
Yeah,
of
I mean, it's just there's
drug running. Yeah.
And I thought, there's no way I could tell them the truth. There's no way I could say, "Oh, this is for Harvard." There's
sure. Yeah.
Right. That would make it even worse, right? So I was in a huge predicament, and I was just praying, talking to God the whole way over there. I was like, "God, please help me, because I know I can't tell the truth here. I know I don't know what to do, and all this work, and they're going to take the money away." That day, they didn't search my purse.
Amazing. Now, this is something like little known reality. There are many examples of civil asset forfeiture. So civil asset forfeiture is when the law comes and takes property because it believes property was used in the commission of a crime. And it's a big deal in sort of the world of criminal justice, because in many jurisdictions, you don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the property was used in a crime. You just have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence. So the standard for seizing property is less than the standard for imprisoning a person in many places, not everywhere. And a lot of people have had cash taken from them under civil asset forfeiture because a lot of cash, believe it or not, has trace amounts of cocaine on it. And so dogs alert on cash that is entirely innocent in your possession, but might have been used by like some banker somewhere to snort some lines or whatever. And so there's going to be a hit. There's going to be a trace amount of cocaine. And so there's a lot of terrible stories. This is a total digression, but
oh my goodness! But you're just pointing out that the chances of this money being confiscated were even higher than I thought. Like,
even higher than you thought.
Surely they always have dogs on the border. Yeah, surely a dog should have noticed, but didn't that day.
Yeah.
Ruth, one of the things that's a clear, or at least to me, it seems like a real sort of supernatural God reaching in and acting in some amazing ways. But I've talked with you, and you've often talked about how some of the miracles that God did in your own journey was through people and through people that he brought into your life. Say a little bit more about that and why your story is so remarkable because of that.
Well, so that's the other factor that I was going to share, because when you asked earlier about like, what are the factors, what happened, what put you on this trajectory that is indeed very unusual. In fact, I should say let me digress for just a moment and then I'll get to your question. The second reason why I use the word miracle is that now that I'm a sociologist, now that I've actually studied these things, we actually have statistics on the likelihood of this happening. So we have national statistics on the likelihood of someone with my particular economic background and the likelihood of going through and getting a PhD or going to these highly selective colleges. It's like less than 1%.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The chances of that happening are less than 1%. So if that isn't a miracle, I don't know what is, right? So that's why I use the word miraculous, because it's not only because I'm like, oh, God intervene, I prayed for God's help, blah, blah, but it's also because, like, statistically speaking, I think that's a miracle. And I'm grateful. I'm extremely grateful for all the people. You're right. Absolutely right. There are a lot of people played a very important role. One thing that has helped me is that I'm not afraid to ask for help. I'm not afraid to admit that I don't know what I don't know. And there's a lot that I don't know, even now, like taking on this new challenge that we were just talking about earlier. But the people that have come into my life at the right time, and that have been so generous with their time, with their knowledge, has been a huge factor. I already mentioned my guidance counselor in high school, that played a very important role. And then when I went to the summer school program at Harvard, I met some people that really that shared with me information about studying for the SAT. I didn't know that people studied for the SAT. I had taken the SAT cold. I thought that's how you were supposed to take it. And then I went to Harvard, and of course these people were like, they had been prepping for it since the 8th grade, and I didn't know that that's what you did. Here I thought that they were all geniuses, and I was stupid because I didn't know anything. And it turns out it's because they're prepped. They're all highly prepped. So I met a guy there at Harvard Summer School who literally gave me an SAT study guide, which I actually thought was kind of romantic. That he would do something so sweet. Yes,
that's when
that
you know you're an academic nerd. Is with the
that spoke to my heart.
Yes, it's an SAT study
guide, and FAFSA applications. This was before you had the internet. Well, I mean, the internet existed, but before it was popular and accessible. Certainly not to people like me. I didn't have a computer, right? So like all this stuff was amazing. Gave me a stack of college applications. And then I later found out that he was just trying to arrange things so that we could end up at the same college, which we did. And needless to say, he's my husband.
What?
Oh my God.
Are you kidding me? Really?
Yes, Steve did all these. He played a very important role in sharing all this information. And yeah, we both ended up at Stanford as undergrads and got married when we were 19.
Wow,
and
fantastic.
Yes, and we're still married. Everybody's like,
still,
you got married at 19.
Is Steve still on university staff?
No, he's not. He's teaching at several seminaries. He teaches at Fuller Theological Seminary and Truett, which is out of Baylor, but they have they teach courses here in Houston.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a tremendous story. And I'm not opposed to marriage at 19. My oldest daughter got married at age 19. And
oh, wow. That's very unusual.
Yeah, it's not the norm anymore. And so she's a mom at age 23, and we've got another grandbaby on the way. And
wow,
it's wonderful.
Congrats.
And they've come back to live with us between college and grad school. And so we're living the extended family life, and there's a lot to recommend it. But let's pivot to a word if we can. So you used the term equity when you're talking about educational equity. And so there's a lot of people, believe it or not, in this super hyper polarized time who don't like that word. They don't like the word equity. They prefer the word equality. And sort of the position is there is equality connotes equality of opportunity, that everybody sort of has the same chance to succeed. Equity sort of speaks to an equality of outcome, which is kind of not the norm. Some people are going to do better and some people are going to do worse, even if you have equality of opportunity. And that what equity speaks to is sort of coercive leveling. In other words, so if there's somebody who's not doing well, you're going to push them up. And if there's somebody who's doing too well, you're going to push them down so everybody kind of is at the same spot. And this is something that is very much an issue sort of on the right side of a lot of policy disputes and a lot of policy arguments. So I guess I have two questions. How do you distinguish the concepts of equality and equity? And what do you mean by equity when you talk about equity?
I love this question. David, I'm so glad you're asking this question because you're speaking to me as a sociologist. This is important to sociologists. This distinction is important. Yeah. The distinction between equality and equity. So I'm so glad that you asked. So the way I am using, now I'll start off by saying there are different definitions out there. So I do want to acknowledge that. But the way I am using the word equality versus equity is that, so earlier when I said we're striving for improved educational equity, especially in the area of education, by equity, we mean that we are giving students the resources that they need. So it's not equality in the sense that we're giving everyone the same thing across the board, but rather it's equity in the sense that we're aiming to give some students more resources. So some people could argue, wait, that's not fair. But of course, I would argue it's not fair that they don't have as many to begin with. But nonetheless, that is what I mean by equity, that we aim to give students what they need. So if some people need more, we give them more. Some people need less, we give them less. Now, earlier, though, you asked specifically about outcomes, that sometimes equity refers to like the same outcomes. And so let me qualify that a little bit. So what or often sociologists, but let me not speak for all sociologists because there are disagreements among sociologists. So let me just speak for myself. What I mean by when I think of equality of outcomes, I'm not talking about, because like what you described earlier, like, well, we can't expect, it's unrealistic to expect everyone to perform this at the same level. I agree. However, so I'm not talking about individuals, like comparing individuals. I'm talking about comparing groups. So if we systematically compare groups, say by race and ethnicity, so if we have one group that is systematically performing at a much lower level relative to another group, and that is like, by what I mean by systematically, like, first of all, that the differences are significant, in our case statistically significant, and they are persistent, right? And I would add that we have research that suggests very strongly which are the factors that are causing these disparities, right? So when we see that, that's a problem. That has to be addressed. And that there's no reason for us to expect that to be normal. So what you said earlier about differences among individuals, yeah, we expect that to be normal, that there is a range, that there's variation. But when we're talking about groups of people that we always have in the case of education, right, almost regardless of the educational outcome that we look at, we can quibble about, is it grades or test scores or which kinds of test scores, blah, blah, whatever. But the story is very similar, no matter what the measure, the specific measure that is used, that we consistently see, in particular, Blacks and Hispanics that are performing at a much lower level than whites. And Asians are, depending on the subgroup. I have to be careful about Asians. We can't just lump them all in the same group because there are huge differences by subgroup. But in any case, so we systematically see these differences. That is not normal. And that has to be addressed. And we have through research, we've learned, for example, that one of the strongest predictors, if not the strongest predictor of these gaps by group, by race and ethnicity, is school segregation, just the composition of the school, that has a lot to do. Like, so if we see that when we have different levels of segregation, we actually see different levels of these disparities, that's telling us something very, very important. So that's what I mean by equity. And to me, the equality of outcomes is important, but I do want to qualify it. We're talking about groups, not individuals.
Right. So Ruth, let's just boil that down, because I think what you're trying to reframe is, look, the real issue is, one, like you said, it's at the group level. And two, it's that certain people, if you happen to just be born into a certain group, you are much more likely to get what you need or not get what you need to succeed.
Exactly.
Right. And
exactly.
so, somebody like me who grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, is Asian American, but in a predominantly white neighborhood, frankly, in one of the best public school districts in the country, just by being somehow landing in that situation through no virtue of my own, no effort of my own. Yeah, just pure luck, pure providence, whatever you want to call it. But it had nothing to do with my sort of some inherent virtue in me. I landed in that group where I was in a school with predominantly white, mostly Jewish, actually, high achieving students in a public suburban school. You, again, by no virtue of your own or no choice, you landed in a border town in Texas. It sounds like predominantly Hispanic.
Yes.
And you got a very different set of experiences that got you a very different set of resources that didn't get you what you need. I mean, and so that's, I think, what you're illustrating. So if that's what we're talking about when we say educational inequity, the fact that just by virtue, by pure luck, by pure virtue of who you were born to and where you landed up and growing up, you're going to have very different sets of things coming your way that are going to give you what you need or not give you what you need. If we're defining educational inequity that way, break it down for us. How bad is it? How inequitable is our country right now, defined by those terms?
It's highly inequitable, and the thing is that it's hard to actually measure the extent to which these resources are so different, but people have actually tried to quantify it. And what we've seen through research is that the amount of money that is spent on children, whether, like, we can even separate it out, like just resources starting off with resources that they get from home. So let's not go into schools just yet, but the resources that they get from home, for example, how much money and on average on their children's activities, learning activities, tools, sports, dance lessons, music lessons, all that stuff. If you add it all up, there's a huge difference between those at the top of the economic distribution and those at the bottom. I should add, not only is there a huge difference, but that difference has grown over time, or at least since we started measuring these. We have some comparisons to say, like, going back to the 1970s, and then to the present. And what has happened is essentially those at the top of the economic distribution are spending a lot more. So it's not that it's going like this or whatever. It's just that those at the bottom, their spending has stayed about the same, but those at the top, they're spending a lot more. So parents today are spending a lot more on their kids, all kinds of resources to enrichment activities and things like that to support their. So those differences are huge, and that's just at home.
Yeah.
Then what we also know through research is that because, as I mentioned earlier, because our schools are so segregated, both economically and by race and ethnicity, those two go hand in hand often, that the kinds of resources that they get then at school are also different. And you would think, okay, well, if you want to at least try to compensate for the disparities that exist already just because of their economic backgrounds, then going back to the concept of equity, then that suggests that we should actually try to give a little more, right, or quite a bit more in some cases, to students at school to make sure that they have this information that they need. Like what I mentioned, that I had no idea that people studied for the SAT. And the crazy thing is, though, that's some of the stories that I've shared, they still happen today, like a lot, and that's what is just so frustrating, because it's not that these students that come from these backgrounds are any less talented, they're facing a lot of challenges in many ways. I would say in some ways, actually, they're perhaps more qualified because they've had to face so many challenges and worked hard to try to get through them. So yes, these inequities are huge, and they've grown over time.
So, from a policy matter, I think it's safe to say that policy can never overcome everything. So let's say, for example, you increase educational spending and you distribute it either more equally. It used to be that higher tax, higher property value jurisdictions would often get a lot more per pupil funding. State Supreme Courts would sometimes step in and say, no, educational funding has to be equal. But then you have like one school, let's say they're getting very similar amounts per pupil. One school has a parking lot full of parents' Teslas, and those parents are very focused on giving an educational advantage to their children.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to pour all of the additional personal familial resources they have into their kids. Whereas other schools where you don't have those kinds of parental resources, even if you have equal funding or maybe even a more progressive sort of sense of greater funding for poorer zip codes, it doesn't seem to me that policy can overcome all of that, but it's still going to make a difference. Have you looked at how much of a difference public policy, including in spending in dollars, can make a difference in elevating the performance of historically disadvantaged groups?
I think you're right that, I mean, there's definitely a role for policy to play, and policy can be very impactful. And so we definitely need to keep exploring those possibilities. One big one is, of course, as you know, that most of funding for education comes from the state. So mm-hmm. there are a lot of things that our states can do to ensure not only that, first of all, that we invest more in education, because if you compare the amount that is invested in education compared to the amount that is invested in other things, there are huge discrepancies there. I'll mention one example from Texas that I'm sure is not unique to Texas, but that, for example, per pupil, the amount of money that Texas spends on students is a lot lower than the amount that Texas spends per inmate. Now, obviously, there are many more students than there are inmates, so I do want to acknowledge that. But if you break it down in terms of the rate, like per person, I mean, come on. People complain that we can't spend more per pupil. First of all, Texas can certainly spend more per pupil. We have if you compare us to other states and how much other states spend per pupil, big differences there. Texas is it's on the lower end of that distribution. But furthermore, when people say like, oh, we just can't spend more on students, but we can spend a lot more on inmates per inmate, to me, it's like, come on. And we all know that spending more in education is actually a preventive measure for the future possibility of ending up as an inmate. So anyway, all that to say, like, yeah, absolutely, there are policies, especially at the state level, that can make a huge difference. And I would emphasize, starting with just how much we're investing in our children, that can go a long way. And then, of course, how that is distributed. You mentioned a little bit about the connection to property taxes, of course, and then there are ways that the state can distribute those funds to try to be a bit more equitable. Again, using that term in the way I explained earlier, that we can, and there are studies that have shown this, that if we invest more strategically, invest more on the more disadvantaged students, that it makes a huge difference. So money doesn't explain everything. It doesn't do it, but it's extremely important. It is very important. It can make a huge difference. Having said that, there are also things that we can do as individuals and as groups. like churches. There are things that we can do to make sure that we are supporting our public schools. I think that our public schools are a public good that must be supported by everyone, regardless of whether we have children, regardless of whether we have school-age children or whatever. Like, this is a public good that is very important. It benefits all of us. But also it's the right thing to do. Going back to this deep sense of justice that is important to me as a person of faith. We have to do more to invest in our public schools, both financially and in terms of our time, and in terms of, there are many ways that we can invest. So let me just give you one quick example. Here in Houston, there is an organization called Loving Houston, and their whole, you should look them up online. Their whole goal is to really connect churches to schools in a way that is truly serving those schools, not just financially, but that's certainly one way, but just in volunteers, people that, but they ask the schools, like, what do you need? They're listening to their needs, and just being a true servant to those schools, and they're doing a fantastic job. So there are things like that we can do, like I said, both as individuals, but even just getting connected with an organization like that is, getting churches to serve schools. I think we can certainly afford to do a lot more of that.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, because it seems like we're talking a lot about the power of financial resources to try to make up for the fact that there's just these big inequities of just, the conditions that people are born into, and the different needs that they have because of that. So there's some perhaps power of financial spending and resources and investment to make up for this. But I tend to agree with David. There's a limit to how much that it's meaningful. It shouldn't be ignored at all, but there's also a limit. And this is why I was particularly intrigued when I read recent findings by Raj Chetty that talked about the importance of friendship, and how friendship and friendship biases actually are also part of the equation of this inequity. That, as best as I could understand his research, that one of the key determinants of how well you can do in life is just who your friends are. Like, and I guess that gets to who you're exposed to, whether the aspirations that are part of your friendship group, the sense of opportunities, tips you get, like, hey, you should prep for the SAT, things like that just come about. You got it through a friendship and I guess romance that came about. But most people, if you are in friendship networks because you're in a neighborhood with people who are all from a similar cultural, economic background, you're going to be locked out of certain ways of looking at the world, certain just like imaginations about your own future that are possible. And so speak more about that, about the role of friendship, and then how segregation, racial and class segregation, ends up creating this, what Chetty called this friendship bias.
Right. That is certainly one mechanism, a very important one. So what Raj Chetty is pointing to is that the mechanism of friendship is what is explaining in part why we see such a difference in terms of the resources and that students have access to because of segregation, but and also the differences that we observe in terms of their outcomes. And the resources, I would add, like, so sociologists refer to this as social capital, right? That social capital is just as important. Some people might argue even more important than financial capital. That, of course, I just said financial resources matter a lot, so I don't want to downplay them. But social capital can give you access to financial capital in the long run, right? So just knowing who to talk to. I mean, we know this even in the business world. We always talk about like networking and how that's so important. That's how people get jobs and all of that. It's the same thing. And it starts as early, it can start as early as elementary school, and just knowing, what is out there, what is possible, knowing who to talk to, knowing where to get information, that is huge. It's extremely important. But if you go to a school, and for example, in Houston, Blacks and African Americans are many times more likely to go to a school that is mostly poor. That I mean more than 3/4 poor, and so that means that they're, the kinds of information that they're going to have access to, all of that is just going to be very different. And it's connected to the parents too. It's not just the social, the friendships that develop among the students, but their parents and their connections, and then how that affects the students as well. Those are huge. And then when something goes wrong in a school, right? If you have parents that have influence, that have power, that have resources, they will make sure that whatever goes wrong in that school will be addressed, and it will be addressed immediately if they have their own kids in that school, right? But if they don't, then it's not as urgent. And that's part of the reason why I think it's so important to address this huge problem of school segregation, that unfortunately some people still think that that's a thing of the past. It's not. It's very real. It's very present. And in fact, by some measures, it's worse than in the past. So it's very important for us to just own up to this. We've got to acknowledge that we still have a highly segregated educational system in our country, and that it's a problem, and that it's an injustice. It's an injustice, and if we believe in justice, we have to turn things around. Lately I just want to add that I've been thinking a lot about the Magnificat, Mary's prayer, which is stunning to me as a sociologist. To read her words when she's talking about flipping things upside down, and social things. I'm not talking about she's talking about flipping social systems upside down. And unfortunately, when I hear people, are you looking it up now, Curtis? You should look it up. Yeah, you should totally look it up. I hope you do.
You're giving away the fact that I do not have entire swaths of scripture committed to memory.
Come on, Curtis.
The Magnificat. This one's worth memorizing. Yes. No, but like Mary, when she's pregnant with Jesus, right? She literally has Jesus inside of her, and these are the words that she's inspired to speak. And she uses it in past tense, which I love. It's just like, this is a done deal, right? This is, but she's talking about switching, like the proud and the humble switching places.
Ruth, let me interject, because I'm just going to read it for
oh
us,
yes, let's just read it.
I think it is very powerful, and it does, I think, very much shed light on what
we're talking about,
and the sense that as Christians, we have to recognize how much God cares about macro group inequality. So I'll just read it to you. This is Mary's sort of glorification of God as she receives the calling to bear Jesus into the world. And he says, and Mary said, "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. And his mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm." And here are the mighty deeds. "He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful." And I love that, because the definition of mercy is actually equity. I mean, there is an element of equity.
It's not equality. He sent the rich away empty. That's not giving everybody the same thing. It's giving people what they need. Yeah. Isn't that stunning? Like, she's talking about these concepts that we might find a bit controversial, but if you just read Mary's words at face value, don't try to soften it. Don't try to did she really mean that? Well, that's what she said. I find these words really, really inspiring and challenging for all of us. Like, this is what God is up to. This is what we get to play a part of. But
no,
I love these words. I just do want all of us to ponder these words a bit more, and to ask God to show us, like, how does this apply to us here today in our own situations? Like, what is our role to play in helping to bring about this kind of justice hand in hand with mercy, right? How do we bring that about?
So I want to put a pin on, circle back into the social capital issue, because we've talked about the cross-class friendships, and then there's also research that we've seen recently that, for example, when you have fatherless children, especially fatherless young boys, the mere presence of other fathers in a community can make a difference to fatherless young boys. And then the mere presence of additional friendships in your community, cross-class, can make a difference. And it really strikes me that if you're talking to Christian families, that this is a call to not be insular, okay? Because if you're coming from a loving, intact family, and I grew up with wonderful parents, and just thinking of my own life, and I also grew up with cross-class friendships coming from a rural Kentucky public school system. And I'm realizing now in hindsight that just exposure to our healthy family was something that meant something to to my friends. I remember years after a friend of ours spent all of Thanksgiving with us, and he said, "I'd never seen a family function before." And what I think we often sort of feel quite helpless in our ability to sort of change the world. But it also strikes me that a hospitable, loving family, and not just hospitable within your sort of own social class, is an actual force for change. Like a truly hospitable, loving family is an actual force for change.
Absolutely. I mean, it's you're shining a light, right? And it should be shared. It's a precious resource that has to be shared with others who unfortunately lack that kind of a situation. They not only need to be exposed to it, but they need to be a part of it, if at all possible. That's when it's truly impactful. I would add, though, when we were talking earlier about Chetty's research on cross-class friendships, I don't know if you all noticed that there was also mention of not just segregation across schools, but segregation across churches. So churches are also highly segregated by class and race and ethnicity. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And given what your point, David, that you just made, if we were to do better in terms of integrating our churches, not only would we look more like what heaven will look like, but also, that's really where we can develop more intimate relationships and be able to have this kind of exposure for those who do not have intact families, for those who do not have highly educated parents or whatever, like to actually have close friendships where the whole families have close friendships with one another. The church is a fabulous opportunity for that to happen, but we need to do a much better job of that. We have a long way to go.
Okay, let me interject here and play a little bit of devil's advocate, because let's think about a Christian family living in Houston or the Bay Area or some urban environment where they could send their kids to a public school in an urban environment that is much more diverse racially and economically. And I'm going to put myself in this shoe, because I think that a Christian parent trying to decide where they're going to send their kids, they're weighing a couple things. So on the one hand, everything that we've talked about wait, I could be a force for reflecting God's mercy. I could be a parent that is bringing my social capital into this public school system that would benefit from that. My family could be a vision for a healthy family. That's all very attractive. And that is actually what motivated my family when we were deciding where to send our kids. We chose a public high school, a public elementary school, in San Jose, very diverse economically in class. And we did that very much out of those same convictions. Okay. we actually, and I'm just being completely confessional here, when it came to junior high, we pulled our kids out of that and sent them into private school. So we were part of that, which was a much more insular class and race environment. And we recognized we were losing some of that, both beneficial exposure for our kids to that diversity, but also our own sense of missional impact. But the calculus was, hey, I got to do what's best for my kids. And I had kids that just had particular needs and themselves that were not being met in the public school system, right? And so speak to that, because I think that's one crucial objection or issue
Yes.
that parents are wrestling with. Like, okay, that all sounds great in terms of a missional, like, I want to be like Mary and reflect God's image, love for mercy and justice, but I got to watch out what's best for my kid. How are
Right.
they supposed to wrestle through that? So that's one I want you to answer. The other common objection among Christians to sending their kids to a public school is, of course, the idea that, wait, they're going to get indoctrinated in ways that I am not comfortable, or that are going to be antithetical even my faith. And I'm going to either send them to a Christian school or homeschool or something like that, because I distrust the spiritual formation process that's happening in public school. So speak to both of those common objections that, hey, this isn't the best thing for my kid, and either for their own educational needs, and then also it's not what's best for them for their spiritual needs.
Right. So first of all, I'm going to start off by acknowledging that I totally understand those objections, and I'm also a parent. I have 2 teenage boys, and of course, I understand what that feels like, right? As a parent, that you want the best for your children, and it's your job as a parent to look out for them and all of that. So I get it, and I understand both of those objections, but I'm also I want to caution us. I mean, now obviously I have to start off by acknowledging that everybody's individual situations are different, and so I don't want to just make a blanket statement and say this applies to everybody. No, I'm not going to tell you what to do, obviously, but I want you to consider the following. Not you, Curtis, but you all in general, right? Like, we should all consider the following questions, like, why are we doing what we're doing? And be really honest about why we're doing these things. The reason why I say that is because I'm of course very aware of our history in our country. For example, many Christian schools in the United States began promptly after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling.
Right.
Not a coincidence. Not a
Segregation
coincidence.
academies. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the name of Christ, which is the part that gets to me, right? That Christian schools, a lot of them were founded right after that, and we have research that shows that documents like the number of Christian schools increased exponentially after that ruling. So we have to be cautious, like we in general, like when we react to these things, like, is it really because we're trying to protect our children, and from what exactly, and what is really going on? So I'm not saying you Curtis, I'm just saying, like, in general, like, this is something for us to be aware of our history, and make sure that that we're asking ourselves these questions. But the second thing that I want for all of us to consider is not just thinking about what we're doing on an individual level or as a family unit, but again, going back to groups. I'm a sociologist, so I'm always thinking about groups and the importance of groups. There are things that we can do as groups that can help to minimize the potential negative effects on our individual children. And so, for example, when we think of desegregating our schools, obviously, if it's like one person or one family that makes a move, and they're understandably concerned about what kind of impact this might have on their specific children. But when we think about actually desegregating our schools in mass, this should not be a problem. Like, there shouldn't be, in fact, there's research that suggests that public schools, once you take account of the starting points, so once you control for the factors that cause students to be very different at the beginning, but if you just look at what is gained, the net gain, many public schools perform better than many private schools. So first of all, I want to be careful about just assuming that all private schools are better than all public schools. There's research that has looked into these net gains, and some people might be surprised about that. But the second thing is that we need to think about how can we desegregate in mass, not just putting the burden on in a family. Let me just give you one quick example of a possibility. Actually, I've learned about this case in Houston right now, but I've seen maps that show this is the case in other cities as well. There are places where we have neighboring school zones. So this is not public-private. This is between public schools that are, but one public school is predominantly white, and then the neighboring public school is predominantly Black and or Hispanic, typically. So in Houston, we have cases like this where we can not easily, but there's a straightforward way to integrate simply by moving the boundary a little bit. You just move the boundary and you've now integrated two schools, neighboring schools. So you haven't, so the cost to any individual family, we're not asking them to move. We're not asking them to, do all, we're just saying, we're just going to move the boundary. We're going to move the school zone, and we're going to integrate schools as a result. Nobody wants to do that because of the implications for property values and all kinds of other things, right? But there are things that we can do through policy to address those issues as well. But my point is that there are ways that we can consider integration without necessarily putting the burden on any one family or or even asking people to move or busing or all this stuff. Like, there are other solutions. This isn't possible everywhere, but there are quite a few cases, and not just in Houston, where those kinds of solutions are possible. And I just want us to imagine those kinds of possibilities and just not, limit ourselves to just, this is just about the burden that is putting on myself or my family, my children. I want us to think outside of the box here.
Yeah, and there's a lot of examples of people who sort of have very inclusive ideas in the abstract that when it comes to being inclusive in their own community, are extremely reluctant. In housing, you see this all the time with the NIMBY spirit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's a big issue where you live, Curtis.
Totally. I mean, this is where the exposure on the progressive side of the gap between the demonstrated public pronouncements and virtue and what they're willing to do. We just recently,
they're not really progressive.
We just recently had a kind of a scandal in our own Bay Area community where some very visible progressives in very wealthy neighborhoods were outed as becoming very hard down against any public housing or any affordable, just even affordable housing, being built into their communities.
Yep.
So.
It's the same kind of thing when it comes to schools. It's very, very similar. A lot of people that claim to be really progressive, or even those of us who study these issues. If you look at some of our most segregated school districts and segregated are in surrounding universities, very elite universities. Sure. So these are people that should know better. They study these things and they know better. But so you're absolutely right that there's a lot of that going on.
And housing and schooling are inextricably linked.
Yeah,
so
they're
that
linked.
A high quality school district is going to have very high home prices, in part because that's where people with resources move, and then often they kind of pull up the drawbridge behind them. And one of the ways I think of the difference between the NIMBY spirit and the YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, is the NIMBY spirit says, at the end of the day, is basically saying to people, what I have is good, and one of the reasons why it's good is you're not in it. Whereas sort of the YIMBY spirit says, what I have is good, and I want you to be in it as well. And I think those are two sort of different postures towards the world. And when the rubber meets the road, a lot of the sort of the NIMBY spirit is literally saying to a lot of American communities, one of the reasons why I have something that's so great is because you're not a part of it. And that's a message that is strongly sent and received when the rubber meets the road in a lot of these local disputes.
That's right.
Ruth, I want to, we're nearing the end of the time. I want to talk a little bit to you biographically for yourself, because this is what I observe, and I want you to just tell me if my observations are correct, and I want to hear your reflections on this, which is that in the realm of academia, you make your mark really by publications, right? This is how you get tenure, this is how you get famous, and that you spend a lot of your energy writing more books, writing more papers, and so forth. You're still doing publications, you're still writing, but you've poured a lot of your energy into building institutions, into building the institutions that are new, like this HERC, this Educational Research Consortium, into taking over. Currently, you just took over leadership of the Kinder Institute, which is a public-private partnership, as I understand it, between Rice and the city of Houston that is trying to bring, again, not just in education, but on a broader range of social issues.
That's right.
How do you have the resources of academia actually serve the city and the people making policy? And then you've also done this nationally by building a network with other academics to try to help them connect. How do you institutionally connect your work more into the communities that surround you, that's actually serving it, and you're not just writing papers and getting more credits to your CV, but actually making a difference. It feels like there's a cost there, and to actually choose to invest in institutions versus your own CV. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, Ruth, one of the big themes of our Good Faith podcast is we're really trying to uphold the value of institutions and helping Christians think institutionally and not just think individually when it comes to their own discipleship. That discipleship has a component to it which involves us participating, contributing, helping to redeem the institutions in our world. So I want to I'd love to get your reactions, both, especially because you've made some very choices to act more institutionally rather than individually. Tell us what that's been like, what's been good about it, what's been hard about it.
Yes, in many ways, it felt quite risky at first, but I have to admit, I didn't really start doing this type of work until after I got tenure. So I had that job security in place. So in that sense, it wasn't quite as risky. But it did feel a bit risky to then invest most of my time and energy into doing this kind of outward-facing work that's not really aligned with what is valued within the academy. But it has paid off. Actually, I've been very fortunate that my home institution, Rice University, has been very supportive of this type of work. And in fact, when I was promoted from associate to full professor, they said that was why I was promoted, because of this type of work. They wanted to support this kind of, serving our community through research. So not just through a weekend service project, those are great, but to really support and serve our community through our greatest asset as a university, which is the research that we produce. So that has taken off, and especially in my new role, directing the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, this is broader so it includes HERC, but is much broader than just education research. It includes housing research, economic mobility, community health. We're really trying to link up all those things because we know they're all connected. We were just talking about the connection between housing and education, but really all of these things are connected, and we're trying to take on a more holistic approach to our research and working directly with our community partners to make sure that our research that there's a two-way line of communication, that they're informing our research and that our research is informing their efforts to improve lives and especially in addressing the injustices that are still common in our community. And then with this most recent gift that we received.
Say a little about, because I don't think readers know, but just to say a little bit about about what just happened for you.
Yeah, last week it was announced that we received a gift of $50 million.
That will all?
Is the yeah. That will go toward our endowment. So it's not quite spending money. We still have a lot of money to raise for our research, but this endowment revenue will certainly go a long way in helping us with the work that we're doing, because we're trying to make sure that we're seeing our research as a public good. That it's accessible to everyone, and we want to be able to work with partners regardless of whether they can afford to pay for research. Like our school district partners that I mentioned earlier, school districts can't afford to pay for research. It's considered a luxury item, but research, as you know, is extremely expensive, but we want to be able to provide it as a community resource, and that is why we got this amazing gift that I'm thrilled about, but also definitely feeling the weight of the responsibility, because these are precious resources, and we want to make sure that that every dollar is well spent, and that it's impactful, and that it truly helps to improve people's lives, both not just here in Houston, but more broadly.
Well, you have been incredibly generous with your time. We've gone a little bit over our normal podcast length, but that's all good, because this has been a really fascinating discussion. And it's just so fun to have somebody who has, the policy expertise to, and we've barely scratched the surface here of your policy expertise, but also, the personal experience to really understand the challenges that people come from. We've got an awful lot of people who are researching these issues who don't understand the on-the-ground reality as well as you do. And so it's just such a treat to hear from you, and we're incredibly thankful you joined us. So thank you very much.
And thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, this was fun.
And Ruth, we'll figure out whether I was actually your counselor at the Harvard.
Yeah, we have to look into that. That's possible.
Well, and I just learned that for years I was doing it wrong when I would send flowers to girls. It should have been
yes. Yes.
Like, what was I? See, what was I thinking? But thank you so much, listeners. Thank you for checking in, and please subscribe where you get your podcasts. Please rate us where you get your podcasts. Please check out Curtis's work at redeemingbabel.org, mine at thedispatch.com, and we'll be back next week.